My family spent 7 years painting me as the villain who stole from a dying woman, until the one guest who watched it all unfold decided she'd stayed silent long enough. My name is Lena Vance, and at 34, I finally understood why my grandmother stopped calling during her final weeks. I drove 6 hours to get here. 6 hours of rain-slicked interstate through the Shenandoah Valley, my grandmother's antique brass protractor riding shotgun like a silent juror. The tool weighed less than my car keys, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. My mother, Patricia, was turning 67. She was hosting an anniversary party at the Old Victorian, the one with the wraparound porch where I used to hide from my older brother during summer storms. Eleanor Shaw, my grandmother's closest friend for 5 decades, had called me a month earlier. Her voice was measured. "Your grandmother wanted you to have something when the timing was right, Lena, and I believe that moment has arrived." I hadn't been back in 8 years. 8 years of radio silence. 8 years of my family whispering to everyone in town that I was the sort of woman who manipulates a sick elderly relative, then vanishes when the estate is drained. I turned into that driveway at 3 in the afternoon. Nearly 50 guests scattered across the back terrace. Linen napkins, hydrangeas in full bloom. Patricia Holcomb holding court with a sweating glass of Sauvignon Blanc. My brother, Marcus, laughing too loudly near the rose bushes. My stepfather, Richard, nodding along to some contractor's story about the new county fairgrounds. I stepped out of my sedan. Not a single one of them glanced my way. But what my mother had hidden from me for nearly a decade was sitting in Eleanor's purse. And Eleanor was the only person still willing to speak the truth out loud. I crossed the grass with my hands hanging loose at my sides. A few guests glanced over. One woman, who I think ran the local bookshop, gave me a polite but confused smile, the kind you offer someone whose name you've forgotten. Patricia spotted me first. She was mid-anecdote, gesturing with her wine glass like a conductor. Her eyes landed on mine, paused for exactly 1 heartbeat, then slid back to her audience. She didn't stop talking. She didn't say hello. She adjusted her pearl earrings and chuckled at something a guest said, as if I hadn't driven nearly 400 miles to stand in her backyard. Marcus noticed next. My brother was 38 now, wearing a tailored blue blazer and a silver watch I'd never laid eyes on. He looked polished. He looked like he'd been rehearsing polished for years. His grin tightened when he saw me, the way skin tightens over a healing cut. "Well, well," he said. A pause, flat and cold. "You actually came." 2 words. No embrace, no surprise, no warmth. Just the spoken equivalent of finding a dead fly in your soup. Richard, my stepfather, stood near the bar with a local real estate developer. He caught my gaze across the lawn and offered a small, curt nod, like he was acknowledging a delivery driver he didn't want to tip. Then he turned back to his conversation. My Aunt Margaret materialized from nowhere. She air-kissed both my cheeks, gripped my shoulders at arm's length, and announced loudly enough for the next table to hear, "Well, bless her heart, she actually showed up." I had been home for 53 seconds. No one asked where I'd been. No one asked what I did for a living. It happened near the dessert table. I'd grabbed a plate of shortbread cookies because hovering near sugar gives you something to occupy your hands when no one will speak to you. I was working on my second cookie when Marcus walked over with 2 women I didn't recognize. "Lena, you remember Stacy and Jen from the garden club?" I didn't, but I smiled anyway. "Good to see you both." Stacy tilted her head. "So what are you doing with yourself these days?" Before I could answer, Marcus cut in. His voice was bright, cheerful, the tone of someone delivering a punchline they'd rehearsed in the mirror. "Still renting, still single, still wandering." He said it like a joke. He even laughed afterward, a short, performative exhale. Stacy and Jen did that uncomfortable thing where they half smiled because they had no idea how else to respond. Across the lawn, my mother heard it. Patricia lifted her glass of Sauvignon Blanc and laughed into the rim. The afternoon sun caught the crystal. The sound traveled. Still renting. Still single. Still wandering. I set down the shortbread cookie. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't clench my jaw. I'd practiced 8 years of not reacting to provocations designed to make me combust. And if there's one skill I've perfected, it's standing perfectly still while someone tries to push me over. "It's good to see you too, Marcus," I said. He blinked. That wasn't the script. He'd expected tears or fury or a stumbling defense, something he could carry to the next cluster of guests like a trophy. Instead, he got a woman holding a plate of shortbread with steady hands and a face that revealed absolutely nothing. I didn't flinch. Flinching was exactly what they were waiting for. Here is what the town of Harper's Mill, Virginia believed about me. They believed I had swept back into my grandmother's life during her final months, charmed her while she was vulnerable and sick, and then disappeared the night she died without even attending the memorial service. They believed I had taken something, no one could say exactly what, and left my mother to handle the fallout. They believed Patricia was the loyal daughter, the one who held Eleanor's hand at the end, the one who arranged the lilies and wrote the obituary, and sat in the front pew looking like grief made beautiful. They believed all of this because my Aunt Margaret had spent 8 years making sure of it. Margaret was 62 now, and she'd built her entire social standing the way some people build model trains, one meticulously crafted piece at a time. She ran the gossip network in Harper's Mill like a franchise operation. She decided who was pitied and who was scorned. And once Margaret made her ruling, the town followed. She had decided I was scorned. I moved through that party like someone touring a museum exhibit about their own ruin. "Poor Patricia," I heard a neighbor murmur, "after everything with that girl." A woman near the rose bushes shot me a look that was equal parts curiosity and pity, the way you might glance at a stray cat that wandered into a formal dinner. I carried every glance like a small stone in my pocket. Each one weighed almost nothing. Together, they were heavy enough to drown in. But here's what Margaret and Patricia and every whispering guest at that party didn't know. I hadn't left because I wanted to. I'd left because my mother told me a lie so clean, so perfectly cruel, that it took 8 years and one envelope to undo. The most expensive thing I ever brought home wasn't a car. It was a letter. 8 years earlier, I was 26 and working my first real architecture job in Roanoke when my grandmother Eleanor got sick. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors gave her 3 to 6 months. I came home immediately. I cooked for her. I drove her to radiation in Charlottesville, an hour each way, 4 times a week. I read to her from the engineering journals she loved. Old ones from the 1960s with handwritten notes in the margins, bridge schematics she'd sketched herself when women weren't supposed to understand structural loads. I slept on the pull-out couch in her study for 4 months. Patricia came by on Saturdays. Marcus sent flowers once. Richard mowed the lawn. On a Thursday in September, Eleanor had a terrible night. I stayed up with her until 3 in the morning, then fell asleep in the armchair beside her bed. At 7 a.m., my mother called. "Go home, Lena, get some rest. I'm coming over to sit with her." So I drove back to the main house. I showered. I lay down for 2 hours. When I woke and called the house phone, Patricia answered on the first ring. "She's gone, passed about an hour ago." I couldn't speak. "It was peaceful," my mother said. Her voice was flat and smooth, like a frozen lake with something dark moving beneath the ice. "Just family at the end?" I drove back. I ran up the porch steps. I tried to go into the bedroom, and Patricia stepped into the doorway, blocking it. She looked at me the way you look at a dog that's chewed up a shoe. "She didn't want you there, Lena. I was protecting her." 6 words and a name. That sentence lived inside me for 8 years like a bone that never healed correctly. Eleanor Vance had been an architectural draftsman, not officially. Women in 1963 didn't get that title. She worked for a civil engineering firm in Richmond as a secretary, which meant she redrew 3/4 of their blueprints and never saw her name on a single sheet. She told me about it the way other grandmothers told bedtime stories, with patience, dry humor, and the quiet understanding that the ending was fundamentally unjust. When I was 13, she gave me her brass protractor. It was heavier than it looked, warm-toned, with a hinge that moved like oiled silk. She kept it in a leather pouch lined with forest green felt. "This is the only tool that ever had my initials on it," she said, turning it so I could see the tiny EV scratched into the base. "I want you to put yours next to mine." I never did. It felt too sacred to mark. The protractor became the thing I reached for when the world tilted. Through college, through my first job, through the night I packed a bag and left Harper's Mill with nothing but my car and a box of books. The protractor sat in whatever drawer or pocket or glove compartment was closest. It was the size of a key. It held me steady the way a keel holds a ship steady. Marcus had wanted it. I remember his face the day Eleanor handed it to me. 13 and 15, standing in my grandmother's study, and Marcus's expression went sharp and still, the look of someone calculating a debt they intended to collect. He never said anything. He didn't have to. The ledger started that afternoon. Eleanor told me something else that year, sitting on the porch with a glass of sweet tea and a pencil tucked behind her ear. "You don't owe them your proof, Lena." I was 13. I didn't understand. I do now. Back at the party, I leaned against the porch railing and watched the lawn like a woman who had absolutely nowhere better to be. The truth, which no one at this gathering was going to hear from me, was that I had spent the last 5 years building a structural architecture firm called Vance and Ridge out of a 2-room office in Charlottesville. We started with residential inspections, then small historic restorations. Then 20 months ago, we won the contract for the Harper's Mill Riverfront project, the largest heritage renovation in the county's history. $3.8 million, 18 months of work. The project this entire town had been buzzing about for 2 years. My firm, my designs, my name on the contract. But here at this party, I was still the girl who exploited her dying grandmother and vanished. I let them think that. Eleanor had taught me why. When we'd drive past the Porsche dealership on Route 29, she'd slow the car slightly, not to stare exactly, but to let the sunset catch the windshields. "You'll have one someday, Lena, and when you do, you won't drive it here to show them. You'll drive it because you earned the silence." I was earning the silence right now. The charcoal gray sedan I'd parked at the bottom of the long gravel driveway, behind the catering van, half hidden by the old weeping willow, cost more than my mother's annual fundraising total for the Harper's Mill Historical Society. No one had noticed it yet. No one was looking. That was fine. I hadn't come back for the car. I hadn't come back to prove a single thing. I'd come because Eleanor had asked, and because the woman who raised me deserved at least one person at this party who remembered her truthfully. Eleanor Shaw found me on the porch at 5:45, right as the afternoon light turned to gold. She was 87 years old, 5'3", and she moved like a woman who had never been in a hurry and never been late. Her silver hair was pinned up, and she wore a cream cardigan with wooden buttons that looked older than my mother. She carried a small leather clutch, the kind women her age hold with both hands against their chest, like it contained something that mattered. "There you are," she said, and she hugged me. A real hug. Arms around my shoulders, her palm on the back of my head, holding me the way my grandmother used to hold me when I was small and frightened. No one else at that party had touched me all evening. "I'm so glad you came," she said, pulling back to study my face with those pale blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "You look more like her every year, you know." "Thank you for calling me, Eleanor." She patted my arm. "Your grandmother would have wanted you here." Then she looked out at the party, at Patricia working the crowd near the hydrangeas, at Marcus refilling wine glasses with the attentive performance of a son who needed an audience. And something flickered across Eleanor's face. A tightening. The look of a woman who had been keeping a promise for a very long time and was growing tired of waiting. "I have something for you," she said quietly. "When the timing is right." She squeezed my hand once, firm, then walked back toward the lawn. I watched her go. She stopped near the dessert table and picked up a plate as if nothing had happened. 87 years old and still the best poker face in Harper's Mill. Whatever Eleanor was carrying had waited 8 years. It could wait a little longer. but I had a feeling it wouldn't have to. The party settled into its rhythm after 6. Someone plugged in fairy lights. A playlist of quiet jazz drifted from a speaker near the kitchen door. Patricia moved between clusters of guests like a gallery owner at an opening, touching elbows, laughing in that rehearsed way, making sure every glass was full and every impression was carefully managed. I sat at a table near the fence with a glass of water and watched my family perform. Marcus was telling a group about the Harper's Mill riverfront restoration, the project he kept calling our town's legacy landmark. He used words like revitalization and historic preservation, and I watched the guests nod along, impressed. Marcus's wife, Brett, had apparently joined the advisory committee. Patricia had hosted 2 fundraising luncheons for it. Richard had donated lumber from his hardware store. The Vance name was all over that project, just not the right Vance. I took a sip of water and said nothing. There's a specific kind of discipline in listening to people take credit for your work while you hold your glass steady and let them finish. I'd been practicing it for years. I was very good at it. A woman named Cheryl, I recognized her from the school board, leaned over to me. "And what do you do, sweetheart?" Patricia materialized beside me before I could answer. She put her hand on my shoulder, the first time she'd touched me all evening, and said with a soft, careful smile, "Lena is still figuring things out. We're all rooting for her." The table offered sympathetic nods. Cheryl patted my arm. Patricia floated away. Still figuring things out. I'd had my path figured out since I was 27. I'd paved it myself. If you've ever walked back into a room that decided who you were years ago and decided to stay calm anyway, you already understand this story. Stay with me. The quietest part is still coming. The questions kept arriving over the next hour. The way questions do at parties in small towns where everyone has an opinion and no one has boundaries. Each time, someone in my family answered for me. Brett, Marcus's wife, asked what field I was in. Marcus jumped in. "She's been doing some city work, desk stuff." He said it the way you'd describe a hobby you didn't take seriously. Margaret's friend Joyce asked if I was seeing anyone. Margaret herself answered that one loud enough for the next table. Our Lena is the independent type. And when the pastor's wife, a kind woman named Helen, asked gently if I'd found someone, Marcus appeared with a fresh pour of wine and said, "Some people are better off alone, Helen. Trust me." Each answer was a small wall built around me. Not brick, something softer, velvet and condescension. The kind of walls that don't look like walls until you realize you can't move. I let them build them. Every wall they put up was one more thing they'd have to explain later. I kept my face pleasant. I asked about other people's children. I complimented the caterer's crab cakes. I said, "How lovely," and "wonderful," and "congratulations," until the words lost all meaning, the way a song loses its melody when you play it on repeat. At 7:30, I excused myself and walked inside to use the bathroom. On the way through the hallway, I passed the closed door to my grandmother's study, the room where she'd taught me to read structural drawings, where the protractor had lived in its leather pouch on the second shelf. The door was shut. A potted plant stood in front of it like a small green sentry. I touched the knob. It was cold. I turned it anyway. The study was gone. Not remodeled. Erased. Where my grandmother's drafting table had stood for 35 years, there was now a stationary bike. Her bookshelves, crammed with engineering manuals, coffee cups full of pencils, framed photographs of bridges she'd admired, had been replaced by a white cabinet holding yoga mats and resistance bands. I spotted 2 cardboard boxes shoved into the coat closet labeled Eleanor, Misk, in Patricia's handwriting. 35 years of draftsmanship, boxed and shelved like old tax returns. The green felt-lined pouch where the protractor used to live was nowhere. The smell of cedar and old paper was gone. It smelled like lavender plug-in air freshener now. Patricia had turned it into a home gym. I stood in the doorway for 10 seconds and let the room tell me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly my grandmother had been replaced. Eleanor Vance, who had calculated load-bearing capacities on napkins and sketched bridge trusses on church bulletins, who had fought for every inch of professional recognition in an era that gave women none. Her workspace had been converted into a room for Patricia's Peloton schedule. My hand went to the protractor in my jacket pocket. The brass was warm from my body heat. I pressed my thumb against the hinge where the EV initials were scratched and felt my anger rise. Not a flood, just a slow, clean pressure, like water building behind a dam. I let it settle. Anger was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not here, not now. The protractor was proof she had existed. The room was proof they wanted her forgotten. I closed the door. I walked back down the hall with my shoulders straight and my face blank. No one noticed I'd been gone. No one noticed anything about me, which, as it turned out, was exactly the advantage I needed. I sat back down at my table. Eleanor caught my eye across the lawn and gave the smallest nod. Almost time. My stepfather found me alone near the drink station at 7:50. The sun was low now, the kind of golden hour that makes everything look warmer than it actually is. Richard Vance was 68. He had the build of a man who'd spent 40 years hauling lumber and the posture of a man who'd spent the same 40 years trying not to be noticed. He poured himself a lemonade and stood next to me without looking at me directly, the way you might stand near a painting you weren't sure you were allowed to touch. "Long drive," he said. 6 hours. Roads were clear. We stood in silence. The jazz playlist moved to something with a piano. Across the lawn, Patricia was organizing a group photograph. "Your grandmother," Richard started. He stared at his lemonade. "She would have liked you being here." Something cracked open behind his voice. Thin. Fragile. The sound a branch makes right before it falls. I waited. I wanted him to say more. I wanted him to say he was sorry, or that he'd known, or that he should have called. "Richard." Patricia's voice cut across the lawn like a blade. "Get over here for the picture. Bring your glass." He flinched. An actual flinch. A micro-movement. A twitch of the jaw that lasted less than a second. Then he straightened his shoulders, picked up his glass, and walked toward the photo group without finishing his sentence. That was my stepfather. He'd been starting sentences about my grandmother for 8 years and never finishing them. He'd been walking away from almost truths for so long that the walking had become the truth. I watched him take his place beside Patricia. She put her arm around him. He smiled for the camera. The portrait of a family with no missing pieces, except the missing piece was me. 8 o'clock. The sky was violet. Someone lit the citronella candles, and the smoke curled through the air like punctuation marks. Marcus had had 4 glasses of wine by now, and his performance was getting sloppy. The polished blazer composure from earlier had loosened into something sharper, the way a waxed floor gets slippery when it's wet. He stood in the middle of a circle of guests, 7 or 8 women, Stacy and Jen among them, and raised his glass. "I want to say something about Mom." The circle quieted. A few more guests turned. 67 years of being the backbone of this family. 67 years of holding us together, especially after we lost Grandma. Marcus's voice cracked. Perfectly timed. Just enough tremor. Mom was the one who carried us. The one who stayed. He looked directly at me. Every woman in that circle followed his gaze. Some of us stayed, and some of us didn't. A beat. A smile that wasn't a smile. But tonight isn't about what's missing. Tonight is about what's here. Scattered applause. Margaret dabbed her eye. Patricia pressed a hand to her chest and mouthed, "Thank you." I sat still. I held my water glass with both hands and felt the condensation drip between my fingers. The message was clear. I was the absence. I was the failure of loyalty. I was the daughter who left while Patricia stayed and held everything together. Nearly 50 guests heard it. Nearly 50 guests accepted it. The narrative had been reinforced for 8 years, and Marcus had just shellacked it in front of everyone who mattered. Eleanor was watching from the far end of the lawn. She set down her plate slowly. She looked at me with an expression I could read from 40 feet away. Now. Eleanor found me by the fence 5 minutes later. The party noise was behind us. The sky was going dark. She opened her leather clutch, the one she'd been holding with both hands all evening, and pulled out an envelope. Yellowed, soft at the corners, the way paper gets when it's been handled carefully and often. My grandmother's handwriting on the front. Blue ink, firm strokes. For Lena, when she's ready. She gave this to me the week before she died, Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. She knew, Lena. She knew what Patricia was doing. I took the envelope. It weighed nothing. It weighed everything. Your grandmother asked for you, Eleanor said. Every single day that last week. Every single day. She kept saying, "Where's Lena? Tell Lena to come." And your mother told her you didn't want to be there. Told her you were too busy. Told her you'd said it was too hard to watch. I stopped breathing. And Patricia told you the opposite, didn't she? Eleanor said gently. That your grandmother didn't want to see you. I couldn't speak. I nodded. She lied to both of you. She kept you apart at the very end. And then she built a story around it. Eleanor's jaw tightened. I was there 3 of those last 5 days. Your grandmother died asking for you, and your mother let her believe you didn't care. I opened the letter. My grandmother's handwriting, smaller than I remembered, the letters trembling but legible. I read one line, then another, then a third. And the world I'd been living in for 8 years folded in on itself like a paper boat. The final line read, "You don't owe them your proof. Just come home free of them." I folded the letter. I put it in my jacket next to the protractor. I looked at Eleanor. She's going to give a toast soon, I said. Eleanor nodded. I'll be right there. I walked to the far end of the driveway where the gravel met the road. No one followed me. The protractor was in my left pocket. The letter was in my right. 8 years of guilt sat between them. 8 years I had believed I abandoned my grandmother. 8 years of 3 a.m. conversations with myself where I replayed that phone call. Go home, Lena. Get some rest. And hated myself for listening. 8 years of wondering if my grandmother had called my name at the end, and if she'd been disappointed that I wasn't there. She had called my name. She had called it every day. And my mother had answered every call with a lie. So practiced it sounded like mercy. I let that land. I let it settle into my bones the way cold settles into a house when the furnace goes out. Slowly. Everywhere. All at once. I didn't cry. Crying would have been easy. I felt something harder than grief and quieter than rage. It was clarity. The kind that arrives after you've been lost for years and someone finally hands you the map and says, "You were never on the wrong road. Someone moved the signs." I could have gotten in my car, driven 6 hours back to Charlottesville, never spoken to any of them again. My grandmother's letter even gave me permission to do exactly that. Come home free of them. But free didn't mean silent. Free meant choosing what to do with the truth instead of hiding from it. My grandmother had been a woman who drew straight lines in a world that told her she couldn't hold the pencil. She didn't fight loud. She just showed up with the right answer and let the room catch up. I was her granddaughter. I knew what to do. I walked back toward the party. 9 o'clock. The candles were burning low. Someone had switched the music from jazz to something softer. Acoustic guitar, the kind of playlist that says the evening is winding toward speeches and sentiment. I found a seat near the edge of the main table, close enough to hear, but far enough that no one felt the need to include me. Patricia was telling a story to Helen, the pastor's wife, and 2 women from the garden club. Her voice was warm and rounded, the voice of a woman who had perfected the art of being admired. Those last days were so peaceful, Patricia said. She touched her collarbone. It was just family at the very end. Mom and I holding hands. She squeezed my fingers right before she went. I'll never forget it. Helen pressed her hand to her heart. What a blessing. It was. It really was. Patricia wiped the corner of her eye with one finger. Dry. I noticed. Perfectly dry. I'm just so grateful I could be there for her. I sat 12 feet away and heard every word. Every rehearsed, burnished, hollowed-out word. A week ago, those words would have made me sick with guilt. Now they made me feel something worse. Certainty. Certain that Patricia had told this story so many times she believed it herself. Certain that the version of events she'd built was load-bearing. Take it out, and everything above it would collapse. Certain that in a few minutes, when she stood up to give her anniversary toast in front of nearly 50 guests who thought she was the devoted daughter, the woman who held Eleanor's hand at the end, she would say it again. And this time, Eleanor would be listening. This time, so would I, with the letter in my pocket and the truth sitting where it had always belonged. I found Eleanor at the side of the lawn. She was sitting in a folding chair with her purse on her lap, and the kind of patience that only comes from being old enough to know that most things arrive exactly when they're supposed to. She's going to say it again, I told her. During the toast, the peaceful ending, just family, the whole story. Eleanor looked at me. She's been saying it for 8 years. And if I say something, if I stand up and call it a lie, they'll say I'm the bitter daughter who came back to ruin an anniversary party. They might. But if you're there, if you tell them what you saw, I'll tell them the truth, Eleanor said simply, the way you'd say the sky is blue. I was there, Lena. I watched your grandmother ask for you until she couldn't ask anymore. I can tell every person at this party exactly what happened. She paused. But only if you want me to. I thought about my grandmother's letter. You don't owe them your proof. Just come home free of them. Here was the thing about that line. My grandmother had written it for a granddaughter who didn't know the truth yet. A granddaughter who still believed she'd been the one to fail. Now I knew better. And freedom, real freedom, wasn't walking away from a lie. It was standing in the same room as the liar and letting the truth breathe. I want them to hear it, I said. Eleanor squeezed my hand. Then they will. I walked back toward the main lawn. The weeping willow at the bottom of the driveway was backlit by the porch light, and beyond it, parked in the glow, was my car. No one had noticed it yet. They would. There's a moment in every quiet person's life when staying silent stops being strength and starts being permission. I just reached mine. If you've reached yours too, comment truth below, and let's keep going. 9:15. The speeches were coming. You could feel it the way you feel a storm, a shift in the air, a gathering. Patricia had gone inside to freshen up. Marcus was arranging the cake table. Richard was fiddling with the speaker. I stepped off the porch and walked toward the front of the house. The whole property sat on 3 acres, most of it behind the house. But the front, the part that faced the road, was all driveway. 200 feet of pale gravel lined with boxwoods, ending at the street in a wide turnaround. The kind of driveway that announced you before you arrived. A few guests had drifted to the front. Some were smoking. A couple was pointing at early stars. Someone's teenager was sitting on the stone wall, scrolling on her phone. My car sat at the far end, just past the weeping willow, in the pool of light from the porch lamp. A charcoal gray Mercedes S-Class sedan. Current year. Virginia plates. The kind of car that doesn't shout. It just waits for you to look. I hadn't parked it there for drama. I'd parked there because it was the only open spot when I arrived. But now, in the evening light, with nearly 50 guests 20 feet away and the fairy lights reflecting off the hood, it looked like an answer to a question no one had thought to ask. Craig Morrison, the real estate developer, was the first to notice. He'd been standing near the boxwoods with a beer, talking to Richard's neighbor, when he stopped mid-sentence and tilted his head. "Who's S-Class?" he said. He said it the way developers notice things, appreciating the machine, doing the math. No one answered. I was standing 10 feet away, keys in my hand, the brass protractor pressing warm against my thigh. 3 things happened in the next 60 seconds. First, Craig walked closer. He circled the car the way a man who builds things circles something built well. Slow, respectful, counting the details. He crouched near the rear bumper and looked at the badging. Then he straightened up and looked at me. "This yours?" "It is." Second, Marcus came around the side of the house with a tray of champagne flutes. He saw the car. He saw Craig looking at me. And the tray tilted 6 degrees. The glasses clinked. He caught them, but the sound carried, and 5 or 6 guests turned. "Whose car is that?" someone asked. "It's Lena's," Craig said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Marcus set the tray down on the stone wall. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time in 38 years, my brother had no line prepared. Third, Patricia came through the front door. She'd changed into a fresh blouse, cream, mother-of-pearl buttons, and she was holding her anniversary wine glass, the Sauvignon Blanc catching the porch light. She saw the crowd gathering at the end of the driveway. She saw the car. She saw me standing next to it. Her wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. For the first time in 8 years, my mother looked at me directly. Her gaze was sharp, recalculating, the way a card player looks at a hand that's just changed. The glass hovered. The confident smile she'd been wearing all evening flickered once, reset, and came back at half power. "Well," she said. She lowered the glass. "Interesting." Nearly 50 guests were watching now. The woman they'd been told was renting, single, wandering, was standing next to a car that cost more than most of their annual salaries. I didn't say a word. The car said enough for now. The rewriting started immediately. Marcus was first. He crossed his arms and examined the car from 10 feet away, the way you examine a painting you suspect is a forgery. "Is that leased?" he asked. Casual, loud enough. I looked at him. "No." "A client's car?" "No." "A boyfriend's?" And there it was, the echo, still single. He couldn't imagine a world where I'd earned this myself, because that world would require him to rethink 8 years of assumptions. And Marcus didn't rethink. Marcus doubled down. "It's mine, Marcus. I bought it with money I earned at the company I built." His face did something complicated, a series of micro-expressions like someone flipping through channels. Disbelief, recalculation, resentment. Then a hard landing on the only channel he knew how to broadcast. "Must be nice," he said. "Some of us spent the last 8 years actually being here." Aunt Margaret appeared at Marcus's elbow. "A car doesn't make a family, dear," she said to me. She said it sweetly, the way people say sweet things that are meant to cut. Guests were whispering. I could hear fragments. Architecture firm. Charlottesville. How did we not know? Craig was talking to Richard's neighbor about the car's specs, but I could tell from the angle of his head that he was thinking about something else. He kept looking from the car to me and back again, like he was trying to place a puzzle piece. Patricia hadn't moved from the porch. She stood with her wine glass at her side, not drinking, just holding, the way you hold something you're not sure you'll need. Her eyes tracked every guest who walked toward the car. She was doing math. I could tell she was recalculating who I was and what that meant for the story she'd spent 8 years constructing. Craig figured it out before anyone else. He was a developer. He'd been in the construction business in Harper's Mill for 25 years, and he knew every firm, every subcontractor, every architect within 100 miles. He'd been following the riverfront restoration project the way men in his line of work follow big local jobs, with professional envy and genuine curiosity. He walked over to me. His voice was different now. Not the casual beer and party voice, but the voice he probably used on job sites. "Vance and Ridge," he said. "Out of Charlottesville." "Yes. That's the firm doing the riverfront project, 3.8 million. 4.1, actually. We picked up the pedestrian bridge last quarter." He stared at me. "You're the principal." "I'm the founder." Craig looked back at the house, at Richard, who was frozen near the porch with his lemonade, at Marcus, whose face had gone pale, at Patricia, who was gripping her wine glass so hard I could see her knuckles from 20 feet away. "Your family's been talking about that project all night," Craig said slowly. "Your brother brought it up twice. Your mother mentioned it in every conversation I overheard. They kept calling it the town's crown jewel. It is. And it's yours. It's my firm's." He let out a low whistle. The sound cut through the party chatter. 3 more guests turned to look. Marcus had said some of us spent the last 8 years actually being here. He was right. He'd been here, borrowing the prestige of a project he didn't know was mine, telling strangers about the riverfront as if proximity to the town made it his. I hadn't come here to claim credit, but credit has a way of finding its owner when the room gets quiet enough. Patricia caught my arm in the hallway between the kitchen and the living room, out of sight from the lawn. Her grip was firm. Her smile was gone. Up close, I could see the thin lines around her mouth that makeup couldn't reach, the slight tremor in her lower lip that meant she was running calculations at full speed. "What are you doing?" she said. Low, controlled, but barely. "Attending your anniversary party, Mom." "Don't." She tightened her grip. "Don't play this game with me. You show up here after 8 years with that car and that announcement about some company, and you think that changes anything?" I looked at her hand on my arm. She let go. "I didn't announce anything. Craig figured it out. Because you parked it right there, right where everyone could see. I parked where there was an empty spot." Her jaw worked. I watched the muscles move under her skin like small machinery. She wanted to yell. She couldn't. Not with nearly 50 guests on the other side of the wall. "Don't you dare embarrass this family tonight," she said. "This is my anniversary. This is my evening. You don't get to waltz in and what? Exist where people can see me?" She flinched. It was quick. A flash of something that looked almost like recognition before it disappeared behind the mask. "You always did love an audience," she said. "No," I said. "You did." We stood in the narrow hallway for 5 seconds. The clock on the wall ticked. Somewhere outside, Marcus called for everyone to gather for the toast. Patricia straightened her blouse. She lifted her chin. She walked past me toward the lawn, and as she brushed by my shoulder, she whispered, "You're still the girl who ran." She didn't know about the letter yet. She was about to. Marcus was already standing near the cake table when I came back outside. He had a champagne flute in one hand and the cake knife in the other, and he looked like a man holding on to the last 2 props from a play that was falling apart. The guests were gathering. Folding chairs dragged across grass. Someone dimmed the fairy lights. The evening had that charged, expectant quality that comes right before speeches at parties, the moment when everyone stops talking and turns toward whoever is about to speak. Marcus saw me. He saw my face, and whatever he read there made him do what Marcus always did when he felt the ground shifting beneath him. He doubled down. "Everyone, before Mom gives her toast." He raised his glass. His voice was bright, strained, pitched higher than it needed to be. "I just want to remind everyone that tonight is about loyalty, about who shows up year after year, not just when it's convenient." He looked at me. The meaning was a hammer. Some of us chose this family every single day. Some of us didn't. And I think that says everything. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that happens when someone has said something a little too sharp for the occasion, and no one knows where to put it. Helen, the pastor's wife, shifted in her chair. Stacy stared at her hands. Jen sipped her champagne too fast. Marcus stood there waiting for applause that didn't come. Eleanor was 3 rows back, sitting with her purse on her lap and her eyes on me, steady as a compass needle. The moment held. The fairy lights swayed. Patricia picked up her glass and walked toward the front of the gathering. Toast time. Patricia stood in the glow of the fairy lights with her wine glass raised. She was backlit, golden, composed, 67 years old, and in full command of the room, or at least in full command of the performance. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said. Her voice was warm, polished, the voice of a woman who had chaired 100 committees and never lost a vote. This family has been through so much. We've lost. We've grieved. But we stayed together. She paused. She looked at Marcus, then at Richard, then briefly, dismissively, at me. And I want to raise a glass to my mother, Eleanor, who taught me that family is about who stays, not who leaves. The crowd murmured, glasses lifted. A few people said, "Hear, hear." The letter was in my right pocket. The protractor was in my left. Both pressed against me like two halves of a scale. My grandmother had written, "Just come home free of them." But my grandmother had also spent 40 years drawing straight lines in rooms that told her she couldn't hold the pencil. She didn't hide. She showed her work. I could leave, drive away, let the story stand. Let Patricia own the version. Let Marcus keep saying, still renting, still single, still wandering, at every party for the next 20 years. Or I could stand up in this garden full of witnesses and let the truth do what it does. I caught Eleanor's eye. She gave me that same small nod. I stood. "I'd like to say something too," I said. My voice was even, quiet. The kind of quiet that makes people lean in. Patricia's glass trembled once. Her smile didn't waver, but her grip on the wine shifted. I watched her fingers reposition, the way a poker player adjusts their cards when the bet gets raised. "Of course," she said, gracious, magnanimous, the tone of a woman granting a favor she hadn't been asked for. "Lena, please say a few words." She thought she knew what was coming. A sheepish apology, a prodigal daughter routine, something she could absorb and redirect, the way she redirected everything. I stood in front of nearly 50 people. The fairy lights hummed. The gravel driveway stretched behind me. Somewhere near the weeping willow, my car gleamed like a fact no one could explain away. "I want to talk about my grandmother, Eleanor," I said. A ripple of attention. My grandmother was sacred ground in Harper's Mill. She'd been beloved. Everyone here had a memory of her. Her peach cobbler at the church potluck, her blueprints tacked to the coffee shop bulletin board, the way she remembered every child's name and every dog's breed. Patricia stiffened. This wasn't the script. "Mom, you just said family is about who stays." "I agree." And I kept my voice level, steady, the same tone I'd use in a client meeting when the numbers were in my favor and the room needed to catch up. "So I want to tell everyone here who stayed with my grandmother at the end." Patricia's smile was still holding, but the infrastructure underneath it was cracking. I could see it in her posture, the slight backward lean, the way her left hand moved to her collarbone, the involuntary swallow. "Lena," she said, a warning, soft enough that only I could hear it. "Don't." I looked at her. I had never been calmer. "I'm not going to say anything that isn't true." 8 years ago, I spent 4 months living in my grandmother's study. I drove her to radiation in Charlottesville 4 times a week, an hour each way. I cooked her meals. I read to her. I slept on the pull-out couch next to her drafting table. No one spoke. Helen's hand went to her mouth. On the last morning, my mother called me and told me to go home and rest. She said she'd sit with my grandmother. So I left. And while I was sleeping, my grandmother died. I paused. When I called, my mother told me it was peaceful. Just family at the end. I looked at Patricia. She was frozen. The wine glass hung at her side like a pendulum that had stopped swinging. Then she told me my grandmother hadn't wanted me there, that she was protecting her from the stress of my presence, and I believed her for 8 years. I turned to the guests. There's someone here tonight who was also there during those last days, someone who saw what actually happened. Eleanor stood, 87 years old, 5'3", cream cardigan with wooden buttons. She didn't rush. She walked to the front of the gathering the way she walked everywhere, without hurry, without hesitation. "My name is Eleanor Shaw," she said. Her voice was clear as a church bell. Eleanor Vance was my closest friend for 53 years. I was there for 5 of her last 7 days, and I need to tell you what I saw. The garden went still. Even the crickets seemed to stop. Eleanor asked for Lena every single day. I sat in that room and heard her say your name over and over. Lena, where's Lena? Tell Lena to come. And every time she asked, Patricia told her Lena didn't want to come, that Lena said it was too hard to watch. Eleanor looked at Patricia. That was a lie. You kept a dying woman from the granddaughter she loved, and then you spent 8 years telling this town that Lena was the one who abandoned her. The sound Patricia made was not a word. It was something between a gasp and a denial, a sharp intake of breath followed by a shaking of the head that was too fast to be convincing. That's not. Eleanor, you don't know what. I know exactly what I'm saying. Eleanor hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. I was in the room. I heard her say Lena's name. I heard you tell her Lena wouldn't come. I was protecting my mother. Patricia's voice cracked upward. She was louder now, louder than she meant to be, and the guests who hadn't been watching before were watching now. You don't understand what it was like. She was confused. She was calling for everyone. She didn't know what she was saying. She knew exactly what she was saying. Eleanor's voice stayed even. She wrote a letter. I pulled the envelope from my jacket. Yellowed. Blue ink. For Lena, when she's ready. My grandmother gave this to Eleanor before she died. She knew what was happening. She knew she was being kept from me, and she wanted me to know the truth. I didn't read the whole letter. I read one line, the one that mattered. You don't owe them your proof. Just come home free of them. Patricia's hand trembled. Slowly, like a woman putting down something she'd been carrying for a very long time, she lowered her wineglass to the table. It made a small sound against the wood. The last glass she'd set down that evening. You're ruining my anniversary. Her voice broke. It was wet and ragged, the sound of a person whose mask has slipped and who is furious at the mask for slipping. After everything I did for this family, you come back and you do this. You ruin everything. She didn't say sorry. She didn't take it back. She collapsed into blame, the way a building falls straight down into its own foundation. The party came apart at the seams, not all at once, slowly, the way a room empties when no one wants to be the first to leave, but no one wants to stay. Stacy stood up and said something about needing to relieve the babysitter. Jen followed 30 seconds later with a vague mention of an early morning. Joyce touched Margaret's arm, whispered something, and walked toward the driveway without looking back. Margaret herself stood perfectly still, mouth slightly open, the machinery of her gossip engine grinding to a halt for what might have been the first time in 20 years. She had built her social currency on Patricia's version. The version had just been recalled. Helen sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the ground. Her husband had his hand on her shoulder, and he looked like a man who'd just realized he'd been endorsing a story he never should have believed. Marcus was crying, actual crying, not the rehearsed tears from the toast earlier, but the ugly, uncontrolled kind. The crying of a man who'd organized his entire identity around being the son who stayed, and was now watching that framework buckle. And Richard, my stepfather, he stood at the edge of the lawn with his lemonade glass, and he would not look at me. He stared at the grass, at his shoes, at a spot on the ground where nothing was happening. Because looking at me would have meant acknowledging that he had known, maybe not everything but enough, and he had chosen silence for 8 years. I stood in the middle of it all and felt the evening settle. Marcus had called me still renting, still single, still wandering. I was still here, still standing, still my grandmother's. I could have said more. I could have told every person on that lawn that the Riverfront Project, the Crown Jewel, the Heritage Restoration, the thing my family had been name-dropping all night, was contracted to my firm. That the Vance name on the project was mine, not theirs. That the prestige they'd been borrowing had an owner, and she was standing right here. I could have pulled the contract, redirected the work, Made a phone call on Monday that would have unraveled every ribbon-cutting photo opportunity Patricia had been planning. I didn't. I reached into my jacket pocket and wrapped my hand around the brass protractor. The metal was warm. The hinge was smooth. The EV initials pressed into my palm like a handshake from someone who wasn't here anymore, but whose opinion was the only one that mattered. "I didn't come here to take anything from anyone," I said. My voice was the quietest it had been all night. "I came because Eleanor asked me to, and because the woman who raised me deserved at least one person at this party who remembered her honestly." I looked at Patricia, at Marcus, at Richard. "I'm not going to stand here and list what I've built. You can look it up if you want, or don't. It doesn't change anything." I slipped the letter back into my pocket next to the protractor. What changes is the truth. That's all I came to bring home. I turned. I walked down the gravel driveway. The sound of my shoes on the stones was the loudest thing in the yard. No one followed me. No one called my name. And for the first time in 8 years, that silence belonged to me. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires at 9:52. The rearview mirror showed the house getting smaller. Fairy lights, white tablecloths, the silhouettes of guests filtering toward their cars. The party was over. Everyone knew it. I drove 6 hours home with the windows down and the protractor on the passenger seat, where it had been that morning. The letter sat in my jacket pocket. I didn't play music. I didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, the math of Harper's Mill recalculated. Eleanor told me later, in a phone call from her kitchen. Patricia had been asked to step down from the Harper's Mill Historical Society board. Not fired, asked. The kind of asking that comes with lowered voices and phrases like, "Perhaps it's best for everyone." She'd chaired it for 13 years. The board replaced her in a single vote. Aunt Margaret went quiet. For the first time in 2 decades, her commentary on the Vance family dried up, because the story she'd been distributing had been publicly amended in front of every person who mattered. Marcus sent me a text 3 weeks later. It said, "I hope you're satisfied." No apology, no admission, no curiosity about whether the things Eleanor had said were true. Just 4 words aimed at making his discomfort my fault. I didn't reply. Richard never called. I hadn't expected him to. Some men spend their whole lives choosing peace over truth, and by the time they realize the peace was never real, the phone feels too heavy to pick up. The riverfront project continued on schedule. My firm hit every milestone. The town got its heritage restoration, and no one on my team ever knew their principal had grown up 2 miles from the site. That was my business. The work spoke for itself. Eleanor and I talked every Sunday at 2. She'd tell me about her garden, and I'd tell her about load calculations, and neither of us mentioned the party unless the other brought it up first. She was 87. She'd earned the right to talk about whatever she wanted. Once she said, "Your grandmother would be proud of you, not for the company or the car, for the standing still." I kept that sentence the way I kept the protractor. Close, quiet, mine. On a Monday in October, 8 years and 1 month after I'd left Harper's Mill, I cleared a space on my drafting desk at the office in Charlottesville. I set the brass protractor there, standing upright in a small wooden block my project manager had carved for it. EV. And the ghost of a granddaughter's thumbprint on the hinge. The letter I kept in the top drawer. Some mornings I opened it. Most mornings I didn't need to. The words had moved from the paper into my bones. "You don't owe them your proof." I worked. I designed. I built things that would outlast the people who doubted I could hold the pencil. Patricia had my number. She never used it. Marcus had my email. He used it once, to ask if I'd contribute to a family photo album for Richard's birthday. I declined. The terms were mine now. If they ever wanted to talk, really talk, with honesty and no audience, the door was unlocked. But I was done walking through theirs. I didn't come home to prove anything. I came home to stop hiding. My grandmother had said to come home free of them. I'd done something better. I'd come home, told the truth, and driven away free of the version of myself they'd built without me. That was what I'd driven home. The truth. And it cost me nothing but 8 years of believing a lie. It turns out the most expensive thing I ever brought home wasn't parked in the driveway. It was a yellowed envelope, and the 87-year-old woman brave enough to hand it to me. That's my story. 8 years of silence, one letter, and a truth that arrived exactly on time. If someone rewrote your story too, take this as your sign to live free of it. If this resonated, drop a comment, hit like, and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you in the next one.